It's nice to meet you guys. Thank you guys for having me here today. I was going to say, I have some extra copies of my talk. I want to make it as accessible as possible. So if you do need copies to sort of follow along, I have prepared remarks that I'm reading today. They're up here if you would like them. Does anybody need them? You want them back? Yes, sure. All right. And there's like another copy as well. Here you are, no worries. All right, let's leave this right here for someone. So what I'm gonna talk to you guys today about is actually work that comes from my dissertation research. Right now what I'm doing is I'm working on a book. And I'm actually really excited to be here today because this project actually does in some way relate to Ohio, right? Because Ohio is a Great Lakes state, and the subject that I'm talking about actually relates to the Great Lakes. But there's some other projects as well that I'm going to talk about in relation to this sort of central idea of writing actors and creating spaces of engagement that actually do relate to the Great Lakes or Great Lakes states, as well as specifically Detroit. So to give you an idea to go ahead and start, this is where I am in terms of my professional identity, in terms of what I do as a scholar. So I identify as a cultural rhetorician. And that comes from particularly like my graduate work at Michigan State University and sort of thinking about a very, very particular orientation to culture, or how we understand culture with respect to researching in rhetoric. But specifically, I'm interested in rhetorical histories around public participation, specifically with respect to environmental issues. So the subject of my book actually focuses on a particular environmental issue, but it looks at issues of history and public deliberation with distinct cultural groups. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about today, I want to walk through an origin story of the project. And I know a lot of you in here are engaged in research, and hopefully if there's anything that you walk away with today is that origin stories matter, right? What you choose to look at in terms of research says a lot about you as a scholar and your scholarly identity, and it says a lot about how you engage with particular publics. So there are story elements in this discussion today, but I believe that the story is the most important thing that I probably will talk about, right? Next, I'm going to introduce this idea of the Asian carp multiple. So I'm sure all of you guys have heard of Asian carp before, right? Has anybody in here who hasn't heard of Asian carp? Oh, well, well, this is going to be quite informative then. So Asian carp obviously is an invasive species, right? Oftentimes, the ways in which we talk about invasive species more or less frames them in one particular way. What I want to do today is I want to spatialize that understanding of invasive species. I want to take one invasive species and I want to talk about how different people in relation to different cultural groups see that invasive species in a completely different way. And the fact that those different ways of visualizing an invasive species actually matter when it comes to public participation in terms of making public policy, environmental policy, right? The sort of question that I want you guys to think about is, oftentimes when we write environmental policy, we write it to govern multiple spaces, right? One of the things that we don't necessarily take into account when we write public policy is the fact that each of these spaces have different assemblies of actors who are coming from different cultural backgrounds, have different values, and don't necessarily see things in the ways in which we see them, right? So the question is, how do we assemble all of these people to come together to write policy that is equitable and just, that takes into account different cultural perspectives? So that's the argument therein with the Asian carp multiple, or multiple identities for carp. But I also want to talk about this project specifically in relation to some other projects that I'm working on. And if there's anything that you guys might also be able to take away from this talk is, a single project doesn't necessarily have to define your identity as a scholar, but there might be one aspect of that project that you carry on into other projects, right? And for me, that one aspect is sort of thinking about technical interventions, be they digital or oral or whatever form they might take, right? That allows me to bring different people together to solve rhetorical problems, sometimes writing-related problems, but most of the time, communication problems, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have like a Q&A session, and hopefully like you guys will have some like really interesting questions, because for me, I'm like really, really close to this research, and usually what I like to sort of hear how people sort of respond to what they're hearing and what they're seeing. So I'll go ahead and I'll get started, right? So what I hope to do today is create a series of thought, which hopefully will put us in a space of considering our ontological relationships as these frameworks relate to or potentially displace those of others in the process of public deliberation. So this talk begins where most research projects begin, in an archive, because as Diana Taylor quite succinctly contends, archives and their accompanying repertoires of selection, memorization, internalization, and transmission constitute the conduction of communal memories, histories, and values from one group or generation to the next. Archives do indeed generate, record, and transmit knowledge, and serve as heuristics whereby we understand the world and our place within it. Not that there's a single origin story for a research project, but my project began in Toronto. The Life in Crisis Shad Gallery of Biodiversity is located in the Royal Ontario Museum. It's an archive of sorts. Open to the public in May of 2009, the gallery serves the ROM's mission as an advocate for science and the study of nature. The interactive gallery combines 7 ecosystem experiences with approximately 25,000 living and preserved animal specimens. The Shad Gallery offers a unique platform to engage individuals in the fundamental relationships between nature and humanity, albeit through taxidermy, dioramas, and stationary cyber docents. As a natural history archive, the gallery explores our world's biodiversity and the many factors affecting its survival through 3 core themes. First, life is diverse, which illustrates the astonishing number of variety of species on Earth. Second, life is interconnected, which demonstrates how species and habitats are so tightly interwoven that any impact on one of them necessarily impacts the whole ecosystem. And finally, life is at risk, which highlights that the web of life is threatening to unravel due to human activities. I visited the ROM twice in the past year. During my trips to the museum, I've spent a majority of time dwelling in the exhibit in an attempt to understand its epistemological aims and conception of reality through these 3 themes. If you take these themes and the accompanying exhibits for what they are, you'll see them as stories that associate people to places, animals to people, the human to the non-human. They are indeed socio-technical networks on display. Yet when we speak of crisis or risk through the lens of the activities and the relationships, what exactly do they mean? Whose story are we telling? Whose presence is abstracted in these narrative accounts? What actors' intentions are made known? These questions make me think of Thomas King, who writes, "A story told one way can cure, the same story told another way can injure." For example, Christopher Sellers was concerned with fluoridated water and the seemingly dominant US ontology, which was a scientific perspective that drove its use in municipal water systems around the world. Historians have largely positioned scientists as essential actors responsible for shaping the history of fluoride around the world. For Sellers, this was a problem because it was a one-dimensional view of history that did not account for the fact that there were people in other spaces whose differing experiences with fluoride were equally influential in the shaping of the use of fluoride. While these perspectives were never dominant, Sellers argues that they are just as important as the dominant scientific ontology of fluoride, and that they would have had to encounter that ontology in order to destabilize the others in order for science to assume its position. Sellers' work is a history of a material object shaped by transnational flows of knowledge among groups of experts and the lay public. In a different vein, Joseph Taylor was interested in understanding the historical development of salmon management and the crisis stemming from their modern-day population decline. Popular theories regarding the decline of salmon populations often point to overfishing as a cause. His argument, however, is that this popular theory is a one-dimensional view of causality, which excludes space and subsequently the range of different relations that people have had with salmon. His argument lies primarily against historians and their practice, which is the tendency to not consider space and place in the construction of their histories, or, as he says, to depict the past as if people were packed solidly on the head of a pin. Wading through these archives that compose the history of salmon, he uses space to reject overfishing as an explanation for decline, as he reveals the different relationships people have held with salmon through their cultural practices. These geographies are complex in that they mark the story of salmon as not simply about overfishing, but in fact an assemblage of accounts that mix narratives of economics, racism, nationalism, and scientific progress that transpires over a range of spaces. In many ways, we might use these cases as essential reminders of how our practices around archives can veil important stories and flatten relationships. This would only highlight the extent to which we as researchers have responsibilities, not necessarily to our disciplines, but also to the countless others when working within archival spaces. My time within this archive raises scholarly questions around how environmental rhetoric as a tradition makes knowledge about the world. And so I ask myself, how does someone begin to understand the making of an invasive species within the tradition? The answer has traditionally been to turn towards text. But others have noted that this is not necessarily limited to environmental rhetoric. In fact, they have indicated that this is a characteristic of rhetoric and composition as a whole. Raul Sanchez has noted that there is a reluctance of composition to examine writing as network because it stems from our field's resistance against moving beyond hermeneutical approaches in the building of rhetoric. This approach traps us within a system where meaning is embedded within text rather than generated through the network influencing production. By focusing on text, we tend to screen out another important aspect of rhetoric, and that aspect is what I call practice. By practice, I mean the various elements that could be classified as contributing to a rhetoric, but cannot immediately be textualized. These are in the act or embodied cultural performances situated within institutions and framed by infrastructural elements. So returning back to environmental rhetoric, there's a rich corpus that extends our understanding of how language functions as symbolic action as societies, groups, and cultures attempt to define themselves and goals in relation to the natural world. This, however, is a corpus built specifically through rhetorical hermeneutics. There is analysis of written and spoken discourse, but there's rarely movement beyond the text or the immediate scenes that frame the discourse. Craig Waddell's collection, Landmark Essays on Rhetoric and the Environment, is actually most illustrative of this problem. Each article primarily relies upon an assembly of representative texts written by green groups in order to make claims that lead to an understanding of green culture. Rhetoric in these instances remains a textual enterprise where researchers interpret and make claims about practice without actually venturing outside of text. My position is one of non-opposition. I'm not so much concerned with opposition as I'm concerned with how objects and people relate to each other within networks to create meaning. In this sense, I'm resurrecting Homi Bhabha's essay, The Postcolonial and the Postmodern, by refusing to see culture as contained within artifacts, practices, or ideas. Instead of serving as a container of culture, artifacts like text help to produce culture in relation to other artifacts. In this sense, people and objects work to create meaning through metonymy, where we indirectly describe something based upon the things that surround it. Now, I'm not labeling rhetorical hermeneutics as insignificant. Quite the contrary, I believe that this approach has served as a key aspect to building what we've come to understand as environmental culture. I do, however, feel that the focus on hermeneutics has created a gap within the literature wherein we should focus on another feature of rhetoric, practice. It's my opinion that there is a pressing need to investigate the making of green knowledge within community settings through methodologies that are not limited to textual analysis, but seek situated, multidimensional approaches. Such movement asks that we engage with complexity and provide situated accounts of practice in order to make valid and reliable claims about rhetoric. So, I would distill this methodology or this methodological way of seeing the world in 3 recommendations for environmental rhetoric. First, there has to be a reconsideration of subjectivity. This entails moving away from an object view of text and adopting an understanding of text as actors that participate with people and other non-humans in order to make reality. For example, we might ask questions regarding agency with respect to how text creates spaces. Second, there's a need to engage with the multiple knowledges or realities associated with a particular subject. Rather than producing flat world accounts, environmental rhetoric should engage with complexity to create multidimensional accounts of our subjects of study. This would also entail adopting my final recommendation, which regards arrangement and location. This entails engaging with questions of how varying arrangements across disparate spaces coordinate to produce reality in the multiple. So, how do I understand reality in the multiple with respect to Asian carp? I want to take this moment to turn towards how I've approached answering the question, how is Asian carp made? Locating Asian carp's emergent invasibility necessitates mapping out the networks that compose its ontological formations, which give rise to what I call carptologies, right? A little funny word for ontology. Mapping these relationships also requires that we attend to space and direct our focus to the actors whose network performances comprise social life. Foremost, Asian carp is a problem of science. The questions here regards how does science produce ontologies of carp and what are the effects of these ontologies? The term and concepts relevant to invasion ecology enter into public deliberative forums by way of science. We can best understand scientific classification of Asian carp as a discourse that enacts carp in a way that seeks to transcend the specialities of space and time. To answer the former questions, we must inquire as to how does science shape the conditions of the word invasive as it can be readily applied to carp. With its classification schema, ecology presents a dominant field of vision that provides us with a universal way of seeing invaders and understanding their performances. Classification schemas exist to simplify the world by bringing order to chaos. Yet there is a problem with using a term like invasive to describe species. A term like invasive, in addition to transient, foreign, alien, exotic, non-native, and non-indigenous, include qualities that are open to subjective interpretation. People have and build associations between these scientific terms with occurrences in the everyday. And the rendering of these descriptions outside the realm of science can cloud the conceptualization processes that they are meant to describe. What word is best for describing species that are out of place? The use of any of these terms applied to Asian carp bridges the scientific world to X number of worlds in order to build an ontology of carp that differs from one pairing to the next. If you're wondering why I'm spending so much time focusing on terminology, it's because the way in which we label actors, even if we already deem them to be invasive, will produce a variety of orderings that carry different affordances and consequences with their varying hybrid assemblies of non-humans and humans. In microbiology, Asian carp's identity as an invader is performed much differently. Here, carp exists as quantified microbial and macrobial environmental DNA. eDNA comes from the bits of an organism such as skin cells, waste products, which are shed into the environment. Scientists collect this genetic material from living organisms by sampling the non-living environment in order to locate species during the early stages of invasion. And the sort of environments are soil and water, and sometimes air. In August of 2011, the Ohio and Michigan Departments of Natural Resources collected 6 water samples from Lake Erie. 4 of the samples were taken from the Sandusky Bay in Ohio. 2 samples were retrieved from the Maumee Bay in Michigan. In July of 2012, officials from both agencies reported that the samples tested positive for the presence of Asian carp environmental DNA. The 4 samples from Ohio waters indicated the presence of bighead carp, whereas the samples from the North Maumee Bay and Michigan waters were positive for silver carp eDNA. Has the invasion already begun? Is it too late to stop Asian carp? Michigan DNR was quick to point out that while the findings indicate the presence of genetic material left behind by the species, they do not conclusively point to the establishment of Asian carp in Lake Erie. Positive eDNA tests are indicators of recent presence, but this result occurs regardless of whether an organism is alive or dead. Furthermore, there is no saying that microbial particles did not travel from one locale to another via different vectors. In 2012 alone, there have been 80 positive samples of silver carp eDNA identified in Lake Michigan. Yet the fish have not been physically seen in the Great Lakes waters to date. 2 important questions arise from the knowledge created by laboratory procedures here. Do we have to see Asian carp for them to be invasive? Do the quantified samples constitute a material form that structures reality to legitimize said invasion? While ontological constructions of invasibility occur primarily through science, they are also enacted in other spaces to produce different realities. Live carp transported from fish farms pose a particular level of risk as they are performed by members of the Asian and Asian American communities. Not only are bighead carp food fish for some members of the Asian and Asian American community, they're also factor into certain religious practices. In June of 2010, a single bighead carp had been discovered in Lake Calmette. Assistant Director of the Illinois DNR, John Rodner, suggested that either bait bucket transfer or ritual cultural release were vectors of invasion that only underscored the need for the public to be more vigilant and educated about Asian carp. The idea of ritual cultural release troubles policymakers. Asian carp have been discovered in isolated public ponds throughout the Great Lakes region. These carp sightings have been linked to the Hojaway ceremony, although there is no definitive evidence to support this. Primarily Buddhists in East Asian countries perform this ritual, which originated in Japan. It involves the ceremonial release of captive animals as an act of compassion in order to accrue merit for the afterlife and extend the life of the practitioner. It's important to note that there has never been a confirmed account of ceremonial release of bighead carp or silver carp in the United States. However, some actors were so concerned that they successfully sought to ban the importation of and live transportation of bighead carp. While the real and imagined spaces in which Asian and Asian Americans perform ceremony and enact a carp identity serve as their own cultural spaces of dependence, they also rub against the spaces of dependence of stakeholders who are foremost concerned with protecting the Great Lakes from Asian carp. Still, there is a salient point which we should consider. What is the role of Asian and Asian American communities within the United States and Canada with respect to participating in decision-makings in which their own identities are enrolled into networks that cement carp's invasibility? The discussion of carpologies under the lens of invasibility allows certain constructions to take precedence over others. There is a power differential in defining the species as invasive in relation to ritual. I noted earlier that there is no proof of people performing the ceremony within the Great Lakes region. The idea that this is happening is speculation fueled by actors residing within their own spaces of cultural dependence. There is not a lot of dialogue between communities that would reveal the validity of claims of how cultural traditions are practiced or how best to write cultural policy to respect the identities of others, which includes Carp in this case. Discussion of Carp in relation to ritual come from everywhere except the Asian and Asian American community. There is rhetorical baggage that comes with linking an Asian species with an Asian ritual to produce an image of invasiveness. A rhetorical read of such network building exposes actors' spatial performances as not simply about whether ritual can be performed out of place, but the connection of such performances to larger circulating discourses of nationalism and racism. This leads me to my final question of how Carp is legally enacted. Invasive species policies speak the language of immigration. One cannot understand legislative performances of Carp without taking into account the performances of place within pre-existing networks that account for the nationalization of nature and the naturalization of nations. To label Asian carp invasive or alien would connote that plants and animals have citizenship under the law. The problem here is that plants and animals cannot have citizenship because ecosystems neither respect nor acknowledge governments, borders, or citizens. Legal performances require the human extension of metaphor to understand non-human performances within hybrid networks. Asian carp weakens linkages between people and non-humans that assemble to produce networks that reinforce the structure of spaces in which citizens perform their sense of Native Americanness or Canadianness. Threats occur as realized or perceived breakdowns of national borders due to the illegal movement of foreigners across the border. In legal practice, the carp threatens American and Canadian lifeways because of its propensity for violence, competitive breeding, and refusal to assimilate into the natural order of things. These characteristics should sound familiar because they are also the same descriptors that anti-immigration groups use to describe non-natives who they perceive as responsible for a host of socioeconomic problems that include, but are not limited to, inner-city crime, and most importantly, environmental degradation. So, I offer these questions from my study of ontology for us to consider as they appear as both environmental and social challenges, assuming that we can actually separate the two. First, how might we relate with our environments in other ways and make meaningful use of those relations? Moreover, how might we relate with each other on more just terms? And finally, how do we consciously and unconsciously maintain networks through our everyday practices? With that final question, I'm revisiting Taylor's understanding of embodiment and practice with respect to the archive and the repertoire. Still, all of these questions are articulation of a larger concern, and that is to say, what exactly drives ethical action in our deliberative processes? I, for one, see these as the starting point for engaged scholarship. And so the title of this talk concerns writing devices, particularly writing devices as a means of creating spaces for engagement. My research regarding how Asian carp is rhetorically made involves looking at several writing devices, be they scientific reports generated through eDNA, nativist political cartoons, or economic analyses. Michelle Caillon writes, writing devices as critical in assembling organizations, constructing and objectifying services, their consumers, and more importantly, the collective actions that make it possible to deliver said services. In short, he provides an approach to ontology wherein writing devices lie at the center as integral components of how and when infrastructures assemble. While human actors are often credited with inoculating these devices with their own ideologies and purposes, these non-human actors assume lives of their own. In relation to my project, this raises two salient questions regarding how we design writing devices. When it comes to the collective action within networks, what is the relationship of the writing device as an individual to the larger coordination or actions or goals of actors that form the collective? And two, if a writing device can be said to act in rhetorical ways, then what considerations must we as sponsors make during the activity of writing before dissemination? A good example that punctuates these questions is Langdon Winter's classic study of Robert Moses. Winter posited that it was not so much the what regarding devices, but the where. Specifically when attending to that when attending to the idea that artifacts carry and conduct politics, what matters is not the technology itself, but the social or economic systems in which the technology is embedded. Moses was responsible for constructing many public works, which included parks, roads, bridges, from the 1920s to the 1970s. This also included the construction of overpasses in Long Island that presented exceptionally low clearance for 12-foot buses, in some places as low as 9 feet. This resulted in the restriction of buses and, more importantly, people from being able to move freely about the city. The design was purposeful in that it reflected Moses' socioeconomic biases against the working poor and ethnic minorities. Now, Moses was neither the first nor the only person to ever design racist or classist devices. Many urban laws about parking overnights, food sharing limits, or the construction of parking benches with handrails are anti-homeless in design, although their architects might not freely admit this. Moses died in 1981. However, he left behind an enduring legacy that his devices continue to practice his ideology into the present. Although I do not intend to suggest that you're in the practice of creating socially undesirable things, I do want to put you in the frame of reflecting upon the things that you do create as what they may do as they circulate through the various ecologies. Here I'm asking that you all consider what responsibilities do you have as designers to destined and unintended publics with respect to the non-human actors that you create and enable. Part of my book research is focused on the Lacey Act of 1900, which governs the naming and control of non-native species, such as Asian carp. Formal listing under the Act requires an official rulemaking process composed of many writing actors, which includes people, organizations, notice of inquiries, letters, reports, or laboratory procedures. As an acting subject, the Lacey Act creates and supports discretionary spaces for individual and collective non-human and human identity performances that render ontological constructions of Asian carp as either an invasive or a helper species. That's like a very, very long sentence. Sorry about that. Of particular interest is how an act designed to protect U.S. upland game birds now governs the transportation of animals, plants, fungus, and even processed fingerboards from the Gibson guitar factory. Specifically with Asian carp, however, is how the government, in amending portions of the act, worked to completely destabilize the economic space of fish farming, specifically how fish farmers practice Asian carp. When Congress amended the Lacey Act in 1969 to broaden its scope, liability covered violations committed knowingly and willfully. In 1981, Congress removed willfully when they joined the Black Bass Act of 1926 with the Lacey Act. The change in language occurred to ease prosecutorial efforts. While Congress would amend the act in 1988 and 2003, they acted to amend it again in 2008 to address the mislabeling of protected plants. Part of this amendment involved a minor tweaking of language from knowingly to should know. For example, prior to 2008, if a catfish farmer had a bighead carp in his truck and he was unaware of it before officials had discovered it, the burden of proof would have been on the official to prove that the farmer knew that he was violating the law. What seems like a minor change in language switches the burden upon the farmer. Farming catfish through bighead polyculture now becomes difficult. Here, an actor's statement composed to regulate the spaces of the logging industry enrolled agriculture and other spaces, aquaculture and other spaces, with the consequences of transforming farmers into criminals or potential criminals. For aquaculturists, the stability of their spaces of dependence looms largely on key terms within the Lacey Act, which also serve as spaces of dependence for actors wanting to list bighead carp as invasive species. In looking at this example, we might say that fish farmers and policymakers do carp in different ways. But a larger question regards how do we write environmental policy from the standpoint of equity that gives due deference to matters of concern across all spaces? Personally, I'm concerned with how we can create mutual spaces of engagement between stakeholders that force them outside of their spaces of dependence through the creation of technical interventions that bring people together rather than driving them apart. In the case of aquaculture, I argue for a complete reform of the federal rulemaking process that drives the Lacey Act's listing of invasive species. But in the interest of engagement and technical interventions, this is also present in other projects that I've put together as well. And what I want to stress is that these interventions don't have to be digital, but they can take that form. Ultimately, form is dictated by community. And so my attention has always been to shift toward process rather than mode. Specifically, the question at the center regards, how can we assemble actors in order to get important rhetorical work done? And so I gladly want to sort of speak about 3 projects in which I've been sort of thinking about this notion of technical interventions in different ways. And the great thing about these projects is that these projects all sort of center around this research cluster. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing this lovely acronym for a research group, Detroit Integrated Vision for Environmental Research Through Science and Engagement. And this is like a really healthy team of researchers because it involves people from environmental engineering, graphic art and graphic design, the English department, environmental law, and also chemistry and biomedical sciences, right? And what we were interested in doing was we were interested in looking at environmental related problems, particularly that were brought to the university by the community. And what sparked all of us coming together was this event right here. Now, before I play this video, I'm going to ask, have you guys heard of petroleum coke? You have? So for folks who haven't heard of it, so there's the Koch brothers, right? K-O-C-H. And there's petroleum coke, C-O-K-E. Now, Koch Industries is a chief processor of what is known as Alberta tar sands, right? There are these sands in Alberta that are rich with oil. Now, a byproduct of actually processing the tar sands is petroleum coke. What Koch Industries had been doing is they'd been shipping petroleum coke out of Canada into Detroit and storing it on the Detroit River. What you're seeing here is from Windsor, Canada, which is right across the Detroit River. That big bridge that you see right there, that's the Ambassador Bridge. That's what connects the US to Canada. Now, this event was actually recorded when we had a strong wind gust that was blowing the petroleum coke piles. So this dust is landing in neighborhoods, it's landing on cars, people are breathing it in, and the crazy thing about it is that we have no research to tell us what the human health impacts of petroleum coke is, and also what the environmental impacts of petroleum coke is. Let's also compact this on the fact that where this stuff is stored is the 48214 zip code, which is one of the heavily polluted, or the heaviest polluted zip codes in the United States of America. This is where you will find salt drilling. This is where you will find the I-75 corridor. This is where you'll find Marathon Refinery, right? This is also where you're going to find the petroleum coke piles. You're also going to find the sludge incinerator there. Now, it's fine if you put industry out in that area and sort of say, okay, industry, go out there and do your own thing. But it turns out this zip code is also primarily where a lot of poor people, particularly poor people of color, live, right? They are literally surrounded by industry. And we have broken communication networks that don't necessarily allow us to get the knowledge of science to these community groups and neighborhoods so they can go back to Lansing and make arguments about how to write policy or how to stop some of these polluters from being within their neighborhoods. Now, what I can tell you is that up until a couple days ago, petroleum coke had been out of Detroit. It was moved out of Detroit. Do you want to know where they were storing it? Toledo, Ohio. They moved it downriver temporarily in Toledo. And you know how the river goes behind downtown in Toledo? Yeah, it was completely out of sight. They were just waiting to bring it back to Detroit. And the reason being is that Detroit was saying, if you're going to store these things here, you have to cover them. You have to put a tarp over it. They've basically spent the past couple of years fighting against it. Now, a couple of days ago, I just learned they're actually bringing petroleum coke back to Detroit, and they're storing the piles on the Detroit River again. But apparently, it's not quite petroleum coke. It's like something slightly different. And so basically, that's how they're able to get away with not having to recognize that city ordinance. So the reason why I'm telling you this is how our group had assembled to sort of like look at community initiated problems. And this is an image of how tall these piles are, just so you guys have some scale. Because usually whenever I talk about it, like no one understands how big these are. This is literally big. That's the Ambassador Bridge in the background, just so you can see. And you can see that they're not stored or they're not covered at all. But the reason why the group assembled was that we realized that there was literally a broken pipeline within the community. We didn't have a way of actually doing research and actually translating that research in a useful way in which people can use it in order to get certain things done. And so one of the things that we came together and thought about was we needed a particular technical intervention. We needed to map out a means of understanding how we can take concerns of the community and use it in the university to drive certain research goals, right? What you're seeing here is mostly the work that I do as a scholar, which is mapping out communication-related problems. Oh, I'm covering this, I'm sorry. Mapping out communication-related problems and helping other people see a process by which we can sort of come about with solutions, right? So moving on from petroleum coke, earlier you saw that I was talking specifically about an asthma-related study. So one of the things that's happening in the 48217 is the fact that you have a community that's not only surrounded by a lot of industry, but it's also a community that leads Detroit and also ranks high in the nation in terms of childhood asthma. You have a lot of kids with asthma. And one of the things that, if you know anything about asthma, is it's really, really hard to pinpoint what causes asthma. There's a ton of factors. However, one of the things that doctors are trying to do is they're trying to like pinpoint, right? They're trying to get enough data that helps them understand, okay, what does the environment look like for people who are asthma sufferers? What triggers do they have, right? The more data that we have will allow us to treat people better. So what we're doing in this project is we're working with about 60 to 80 teens who are referred to us from the Henry Ford Clinic. And what we're doing is we're doing a citizen science project where my friend, Sean McElmurray, is actually redesigning personal air monitors. So normally whenever they do these air quality tests or studies, they usually have people wear backpacks that they have to wear around on a regular basis, or there are carts that they drag, which basically samples the air at any given time. Sean has actually re-engineered a personal air monitor so that it's like a handheld, kind of like your coffee thing right there, only a little bit bigger. And what the students are going to do is they're going to carry around these handheld devices to sample the air. Now I'm telling you about like this really cool like technical device that's being made, and you're probably wondering, well, you're in English, well, what the heck do you have to do with it? Well, I'm doing a writing related study, because one of the ways in which doctors often help to understand what's causing a patient's asthma is a symptom diary. But one of the things that you'll notice is that symptom diaries vary. They ask all sorts of questions, and they can be incredibly cumbersome. So what we're doing is we're having the teens carry around 4 different diaries in which they're logging their symptoms. And then we're going to have sort of a qualitative sort of survey afterwards where you say, well, what was your experience using this diary? Now, the really, really cool part about that study is about 10 to 12 students from that project are then going to come with us researchers. We're going to look at all of that data, and we're going to design a digital asthma symptom diary. This gets back to that model that I showed you guys about community engagement, right? Thinking about that technical intervention, right? And it actually feeds that model in a variety of ways, right? It gets kids interested in science. It helps kids learn a little bit more about their symptoms and their issues. It also solves a problem within the community. And it creates different relationships. It creates different relationships between researchers and the students and their parents, but more importantly, the students and their doctors. It's a technical intervention that helps them manage their asthma in a better way. That's how writing factors in that. That's how the stuff that we do makes that important, right? And I would say that I'm probably the most integral part of that project because I am literally the sort of sinew that's keeping everybody together. And so hopefully you guys can sort of think about the work that you're doing much in the way that I think about the work that I'm doing here, right? It's important. You're not necessarily just looking at words, right? Words matter. If anything that you guys may have taken from my study of carp, it's literally that the changing of a single word has the effect to change an entire person's reality, to affect the ways in which they move about a city, or even understand themselves in relation to other people. So thank you.
All right, questions?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so as I'm sure you might have guessed, I'm really excited about your research. But and I'm really excited that you're focusing on community engagement because I view myself as like an environmentalist first and then a scholar. And but I'm wondering, I'm encountering this sort of public that doesn't really care. So they're not in this area, they don't have asthma, that sort of thing. And how to sort of convince them of these problems because I think that's sort of a public that goes kind of unaddressed.
So this is
doing that.
So this is interesting because I talked to my environmental rhetoric students about this, and I think that this is a problem that's not necessarily just I'm like out of words now. This is not just a problem that's unique to environmental rhetoric. This is a problem that I think spans a lot of rhetorical issues. And it's this question of, do you see the problem as individual or do you see the problem as systemic, right? If you see a problem as individual, you can write it off. You don't have to worry about it. And I would say that you could see that in politics, right? You could see that with things like social inequality. Why is this person poor over here? This person's poor because they don't necessarily get off their butts and go and get a job, right? Or is this person poor because we've had a very, very concerted effort over the past 200, 400 plus years of engineering social inequality in the form of racist laws, classist laws, sexist laws, homophobic laws, again and again and again and again, right? So the question that it comes back to with respect to getting people to care is this question of, we have to think about really, really specific and rhetorical ways of getting people to see problems in different ways, right? To sort of shift their thinking from sort of saying, this is not an individual problem. This is not a problem that we can sort of associate with an individual, right? How can you say this is an individual problem when this person over here experiences it, this person over here experiences it, and this person over here experiences it, right? That's not individual, that's systemic. There's something linking these people together. And I think that thinking about those linkages in terms of how people are connected, that's the way in which you start to get people to care. That's the way in which you start to open up people's eyes. And again, this is not something that's just related to environmental rhetoric, right? This is something that's related to a host of issues, right? We can say this with respect to homophobia, right? It matters that you actually know someone who's gay, right? That shifts your thinking, right? Because what you're doing in that moment is you're connecting that person to other people that you've known, that you've seen, right? That shifts you. Oh, maybe I should think in a different way. And the research supports that. Right? It matters that you have someone in your network. It's a good question. Yes, sir.
I was just curious about some of the examples of, I thought the invasiveness factor was really interesting just on the species, but examples where an organism might be considered native in one area, but in a really close proximity that would then become invasive. Like I'm thinking of like for example the lake trout, or in Lake Michigan, this is a completely native species. My dad was up there a couple weeks ago on vacation. I was jealous because he was eating smoked lake trout. And I was kind of thinking of lake trout as an invasive species, and I was like, well, no, wait, in Lake Michigan, that's a completely native species, but if you go just a little ways west, like Yellowstone Lake and Yellowstone National Park, it's a very invasive species, and how some of these examples of a creature that is really kind of within our close proximity to us can be simultaneously invasive and non-invasive.
I've got a better example that hits closer to home, and actually it's a public service announcement. So how many of you guys like cats? How many of you have cats? How many of you have outdoor cats? Okay, this is public shaming. You're bad people. And the reason being is that one of the things that we've seen within the past 20 years is that in the southeastern United States, we've seen a drastic decrease in the songbird population. And that's because of feral cats, right? Some of these are domesticated cats that people have that they let outside and let back inside at any given time. And some of these are cats that are just abandoned, right? One of the things that people don't understand is that cats don't necessarily hunt for food. Cats hunt for fun. Cats will kill. Your cat's a murderer if you don't even know. Your cat's killing people all the time, left and right. Just doesn't care, right? And the thing is that it would be fine, right, to sort of leave these animals out there if they were sort of like wild, right? But the problem is a lot of these birds, they haven't necessarily adapted with that particular predator, right? If you think about their structure, their eyes are positioned so they're looking for things that are coming down, not necessarily something that's like sort of darty. They don't really have those movements. And so like the feral cat situation is a situation that I do think like hits close to home, right? Because everybody loves cats. Everybody, well, not everybody, but like everybody likes cats. They understand cats. They would never see cats as being invasive. But your cats are invasive the minute they leave your house. They shouldn't leave your house. But of course, people have grown up with this idea of this, having barn cats, having cats that are outside, right? They're not really doing anything, right? So, I mean, that's one example. That's an example that I think pretty much outside of like sort of fishing communities, that's the one thing that I know lots of people have some sort of experience with. Whatever, it doesn't matter, yeah.
So in talking about the group that you have that's working on these community problems, so you have science and business and academics, and those groups all speak a kind of specialized language. So now you're bringing in these students or these asthma sufferers and these other community members, and in some ways you're giving them ownership, authority, language for their own conditions. So then I guess my question, I don't really even know how to articulate it, but on the one hand then, is there pushback from the groups who traditionally controlled that language and now that language is being given to some other group? And then what are kind of the long-term implications of that? Like I'm thinking just as an academic, right? I mean, we kind of take pride in our language and that not everyone can always understand what we're talking about except this other elite little group. So then is the erosion of that going to help solve the problem?
So this is really interesting because we dealt with this in our group, and I would say we have one member in our group who, for lack of a better term, I think she's probably out. I think she sort of like removed herself. I would probably say that maybe like we encouraged her to leave. But the thing about it is that obviously we're doing sort of like engagement work that you might say is citizen science, right? And where that model sort of fell apart was the fact that early on in the pet Coke situation, we were like, well, how are we going to get samples? Right? It's one thing to be researchers going into communities and taking samples, but I gave you guys like the demographics of the communities, right? What I can tell you is that there are not a lot of like people of color like on our research team, And it actually is kind of awkward to sort of have people like, going into communities and collecting samples, because there's a really negative relationship between university researchers and communities. And so one of the things that we said was, well, why not have the residents collect the samples, right? Why not teach the residents the science behind collection and actually sort of analyzing the samples within the labs? You have to understand that we argued for an hour and a half about uninitiated people collecting data. This one person in particular said, there's no way, I can't allow that. They will not allow that to be published in my field. No journal would accept this, right? And I'm sitting here and I'm walking around and I'm like, I cannot even believe that I'm hearing this, right? Because think about it. Think about where you guys are in your education, right? If you're a grad student, you don't have an MA yet. Why is it that you without an MA have more authority in terms of creating knowledge than someone in a community if you all know how to do the same thing at the same time, right? If you all know the consequences behind why you should follow certain procedures, right? There's nothing about a speciality that makes one person better than the other. This is literally this person sort of saying, these people are not within our area. I'm fine with them doing certain things, but I'm not fine with them doing other things, right? And so we that was a tension wherein we struggled. But the thing that went on in that room after she left, and I think it still goes on now, and it's still something that I'm not struggling with personally, but I'm trying to help some of my colleagues understand this, is that the model that we're doing, this is very important, the model that we're doing forces us to change the ways in which we do research in the university. Which means I might not be able to, well, I will be able to publish on this, but there may be projects that I can't publish on, right? And that's fine. I don't care, right? The reason that you're doing engagement work has nothing to do with, you wanting to be a prestigious researcher or anything like that. It's because you see that there's important work that needs to be done, and it transcends you, it transcends the institution, right? And that's what we're doing here. And so the argument that I've had with one of the researchers who's still on has to do with the fact that the Pet Coke project is grant funded. And the people who basically are these rich donors who are giving us this money, they really want to see publications. Well, we have the sciences, which turns out articles like crazy. And then we have writing studies, which, I think it takes 2 years for things to come out? I was literally in a meeting a couple weeks ago where they were like, well, you got to publish something. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way, right? I had to map it out. I was like, this is not going to happen, right? You're not going to have quality research come out from this study in a quick time like that. And even if we did publish something quickly, right, you have to think about the quality. It's not necessarily my butt that's on the line. It's also the community, right? I think that you have to think about that relationship in a very, very careful way, right? Thinking about how you're describing people, how you're using people's time, right? So ultimately, the situation, getting back to your question, it literally is we have to change the way in which we research, and we have to be comfortable about it. The larger issue, and this is for people who are thinking about becoming faculty members, right? The larger issue is it's not necessarily just changing the way that we think. It's also institution change. It's literally going back to your department and going back to the university and saying, we have to completely change the tenure process, right? We have to change how we value knowledge, whether collaborative work is acceptable, whether community members can actually write articles with us, which I have to say, if you do a research project, try to figure out ways in which to write with community members. Try to figure out ways in which to build in deliverables that not only make you happy and allow you to keep a job, but also allows them to do things that they need to do, right? And nurture those relationships. Keep them. Do things outside of that research project. For instance, if anybody, I don't know if anybody's ever worked with like Native communities before, but oftentimes, like, right, like trust is really important in a lot of ways because of like the historical problems that the US government has had with Native communities. So you might want to like work research-wise with indigenous communities, but you might have to think about the fact that it takes time, right? You might show up and maybe you're not doing an interview. Maybe they're like, we need you to go dig a hole. Go and dig that hole. Get dirty. Come back. Dig more holes. Right? But again, this is getting back to this idea that it is if you're committed to this idea of researching in this way, then you have to be committed to the fact that it's a long process. It may be 4 or 5 years or 3 years, right, before you can even publish anything. But again, it's well, what do you value, right? This is not for everybody. I'm not saying that everybody has to adopt it. I'd love if everybody adopted it, but I don't think they can.
All right, guys, on that note, we have to wrap up, but if you want to talk to Dr. Sackey afterwards, stick around, ask him some questions. So let's clap.